Hi, it's Natalie Topa again. Now I want to talk about how we can construct some neighborhood design that is more regenerative, more permaculture, and more eco-village in how we interact with our living space and the people around us. Um, I'm going to focus heavily on the built environment here, and the reason is because oftentimes we feel so helpless. We just live in these cities. We're stuck in traffic jams. We don't think that we have any say over how the environment around us is built, how it's connected, how it all flows, and that's not always the case. One major benefit of living in a developed context with strong and good governance systems and rule of law is that we do have systems in place where civic agency can play out, where citizens have a voice and they actually can affect and persuade and influence how the built environment around them feels and looks and how it functions. So I'm going to break this down into to several elements that I think are important. If I were building a city from scratch, these are the key things that I would want to think about. I'm starting with transportation, and that's because humans move. We move to work, we walk, we have to get to places to do the things that we do. And unfortunately, in much of the developed world, namely the United States, that element of our physical environment has been usurped by private and commercial interests. And I say that because in the 1940s, the U.S. actually had a very strong system of street trolleys, and it was functional, it was reliable, people loved it, they enjoyed it. They would wake up in the mornings and they would see their neighbors and friends in the trolley on the way to work. They could have their newspaper, fraternize, and have casual encounters with their community members. What happened was that General Motors actually started to buy out the trolley car lines and to degrade the service right away. So suddenly, or actually, over time, the streetcar was not as reliable. They would break down. They weren't being maintained, and they just started to lose their appeal as being the effective, reliable system that they were. Simultaneously, what General Motors started to do was to ramp up as they were degrading the service. Actually, they phased out the service. It was so bad, and they started to come with buses and diesel-run buses. So that was a new system of public transportation. Then, what they did was to have an aggressive campaign marketing the individual vehicle, and basically the message was, look, this public transit is not effective, it's not convenient, it's not reliable, it's not safe. And the best option is to have your own individual car where you don't have to rely on any other system and you can just get to where you need to go. So that was the beginning of dismantling the really extensive public transportation network at an urban level that we started to have in the West Coast in the United States, while our counterparts in other parts of the developed world were investing heavily and continued and historically had networks and systems that catered to public transportation. So just like in permaculture, we focus on swales and earthworks, right? When you are setting out to plan your land or your permaculture design for wherever you are, first we plant the water, right? We plant the water and then we plant the plants, because the water is that sort of bare bones infrastructure. It's the skeleton of your design. And in an urban environment or a neighborhood even, I'm talking about urban, suburban, not the master planned intentional community eco-village. Where you are right now in an urban or suburban area, that infrastructure, the skeleton of where you are, is roads and rights of way for utilities and all of that infrastructure. So the reason that I'm focusing right now on the public transportation is because of the seamlessness. And what I mean is, we want our communities to be interconnected and have safe and seamless intermodal transit. I say intermodal and not multimodal because multimodal, what does multimodal mean? Multimodal means you've got different modes and they're operating simultaneously in parallel to one another, but that doesn't mean that they're integrated. So let's say I'm in Sydney, Australia, and I have a bike, and I can go to work on my bicycle because we have bike paths or sidewalks that allow for multiple users, but I can take that to a bus stop or a light rail or a metro, and I can take my bike and get from the bike path or the sidewalk onto the bus or the metro or the light rail. And there's a rack, there's a space, there's a spacious car maybe reserved for bicycles, and then I can get off of my stop and then continue on to another mode. Or I can even lock up my bike and walk or rollerblade or whatever. The point is that seamlessness of being able to move, smoothly from one mode to another is very important, because think about who uses public pedestrian realm. Mothers, fathers with baby carriages, we've got people in wheelchairs, you've got skateboarders, you have a lot of different people who are not in a car pumping fossil fuels, and we need to create space, we need to plan for that in the public realm. If we look at some Scandinavian countries, I mean, that's what they do first, and that is a huge priority. And so what does that mean for you? If you're a resident of an urban area, how can you start creating metros? Well, you can't as one person, but as many people, you can show up at board meetings of the local transit agency, you can connect with your city council members, your mayor's office, your county government, and you can express that this is where we want taxpayer dollars to go. Not everybody likes to use public transportation, and that is okay. I haven't had a car in many years, but I remember having a car and loving it. I used to go on long rides with the sunroof open and do road trips, but I also loved parking my car and walking and going to cafes and being in healthy, thriving urban environments. And so just like swales or earthworks in a permaculture design for food production, when we're talking about placemaking in the urban context, that is a very critical starting point. So you do have a voice. If you have a system of governance where you can express that voice, be bold, and don't think that just because you're not an engineer or a city planner that you have no idea about how to demand these things. You're a pedestrian, you may be a bike rider. Where are your bike paths? Are they open at night? Are they painted? Are they paved? Do they have solar lights? Are they accessible at all times of day? Are they an actual viable route for commuting? So public transit and mass transit is a very, very key thing. Let me just refer to my notes on the next point. So the next point I want to talk about is water for resilience. This is hugely important in my context where I am now in East Africa and part of the Middle East, because we are dealing with very drought-prone areas and places of water scarcity. Water for resilience is something every person should be thinking about and acting towards, whether you're in a tropical environment, a drylands area, or in the urban US or Europe. So there's two kinds of water I want to talk about. We've got big water and little water. Big water is, what is the source of our municipal water? If you look at what's happening in Cape Town right now, or California, or Delhi, water scarcity is becoming such a critical issue that municipalities have not planned for. So the question to ask is, what is the source of water in your community, and how can you apply your voice to ensure that it is heard by the local government that we are demanding systems that are more regenerative, that there are regulations that are in place, new construction that is very water expensive, how drainage systems are in place and how they remove critical water resources just for the virtue of drainage. Where is that water going, and what amount of energy is being spent to take that water away from where it is needed, and just generally, how can we start to transform into more regenerative systems? So ask about where it is that you are, what are the sources of water, and how can on a large scale awareness be raised, and modifications be made so that at the larger level we are considering these issues and voting on them, that they are in the voting booth, that our candidates are talking about it. It's a very critical issue. Now, little water is much easier. It's much more in your control. By little water, I mean at your household level, what can you do to harvest every drop of rainwater that falls wherever you are? And unless you are in the North or South Pole, water falls where you are. Even if you are in Saudi Arabia and you only get 11 millimeters per year, catch those 11 millimeters. So this is really about what I refer to as structural water harvesting rather than in the landscape. So whether you're talking about rooftops or roads or curb and gutter, that water is there to be caught. So there's a lot of things that you can do, whether it's on your rooftop or through the gutters, or even what is rushing down your street. How can you catch that water? And how can you come up with a plan with your neighbors to cut curbs, to bring down fences or physical barriers that might be urban design elements from the just the local urban design that are obstructions to effective water harvesting and water management and directing it and flow. And so that water, whether it's in planting mediums, by which I mean a strip, for example, like you have your sidewalk and the road, and in between that you've got a patch of long lawn, how that can be cut and flooded with water, or borrow water from the flow of water that's going down the gutter for trees, for food. And this is where within a community, if you're in a cul-de-sac or if you're on a road, a neighborhood street, there's so much that can be done when neighbors come together and say, all right, how can we pitch in for water storage infrastructure, tanks, or building a ferro cement or concrete tanks or whatever it might be, to make sure that every drop of water that comes is being harvested. So big water, little water. Then I want to move on to energy. It's the same thing with energy. Wherever you are, if you are in a developed context in an urban environment, you have domestic and commercial fuel needs and electricity. So how is your life being powered? It's schools, homes, businesses. What is the source of that energy? Is it fossil fuels? It probably is. Or it's some degenerative system. It may be coal, it may be diesel, it may be a variety of things. Now, the point is that there's so much innovation happening. There's so many good things going on, and cities around the world are making a decision to transform and transition into more regenerative systems. An example of that is Portland, Oregon, where they actually capture the energy of flushing toilets. They have pipes that harvest that energy and use that to power the city. Flushing toilets. It's the only thing I like about flush toilet systems. But that's an example of innovation. So are we asking our governments, hey, are you guys doing your homework? Are you on top of the latest innovation? Who's in charge of thinking and strategic planning? And we as voters, we're showing up, we're at board meetings, we're getting on city council committees, we're showing up at mayoral debates, gubernatorial debates, we're pressing candidates for these, we're voting along those lines. So we do have a voice. Even if you have to protest, march, and go out with picket signs and say this is what we want. We want wind, we want solar energy, we want biogas, whatever it might be. In fact, I saw an article of a building in Scandinavia that had a shallow pond on the roof of the building with some pond swamp plants, and the root systems of those plants were connected to an electrical grid that was actually harvesting the electrical charges of those root systems, and it was powering the building. So this is what permaculture is about. It is about mimicking nature. There is no better designer than nature. There's no better engineer. So we just got to open our eyes and plug into that system, and how do we bring it into our lives at the macro scale to the micro. The same thing goes with what I'm calling little energy. At the household level, increasingly the cost of photovoltaics and solar is coming down. It's becoming more accessible. Likewise with wind energy. a little caveat there that I want to say is that about photovoltaics and solar power in general, it does require minerals that are often done in really poor conditions. So in East Africa, where I live, on this continent, minerals for cell phones and all this technology are mined in very exploitative conditions. That means children, women, wars. If you look at Congo, if you look at South Sudan, you look all over the world in poor regions, you have this profit extraction from developed countries who can bring out the raw materials, manufacture them, and provide jobs where they are, and leaving the local community to just literally scrape through mud and artisanal mines and tiny little very poor operations. So basically, I just want to say that solar is great because solar power is what powers the whole world, our planet. But it's got to be improved how we do it, how the practices of extraction need to be done in a more regenerative way. Anyway, solar power, wind power, biogas, reducing energy, right? Using LED lights or automatic lights. I mean, there's just so many things. It's really just, we're only limited by our imagination on how we can be much more effective with how we use domestic fuel and energy. I deal with this here in East Africa because this is charcoal territory. Massive deforestation happens because the domestic fuel of choice, and it's the only thing available in many cases, is charcoal. So we have huge deforestation so that people can have charcoal for cooking as a domestic fuel and for lighting, and so that contributes to major drought. So the next element I want to talk about is pocket parks and outdoor living rooms. And really this is about the public realm and community spaces where we have togetherness. So imagine if you were in an eco-village, an intentionally planned community, you have community centers, you've got your village green maybe, and so in urban places, where does that happen? If you're in established older urban areas, you've got parks. Look at New York City with Central Park. But increasingly, especially in suburban areas, unless it's connected to a school or, or a sports arena or something, it's often harder to find, without going far and getting in your car to get there, just little spaces that are public, but you can go and sit there. There's not a no loitering sign. There should be a please loiter sign. But it's where kids can play. It's where buskers and performers can do their music and their arts and dance. It's where neighbors and elderly people can sit and just watch the fish go by. I say that because when I was doing my urban planning degree almost 20 years ago, I had one urban design teacher who said that humans are like trout. We like to collect in the eddies and watch the river go by. And that's why we like to go to places like Paris and Florence or New York or downtown Denver or wherever, where we have little outdoor cafes and we just like to people watch. But in the absence of that, where do we go? We have to go to malls. I grew up in Denver, Colorado. We actually had park rangers on horses as security guards for the mall. So you had this sort of outdoor cowboy thing going on, and inside the mall we had these rock fake waterfalls, and so you kind of creating this outdoor experience, but you're inside and you walk 5 miles window shopping, but you would never conceive of actually going to the outdoors and going for a hike, and you might not even think that you're capable of that. Yet when you're in this enclosed environment and it's so stimulating and there's so much distraction happening, you can walk and walk and walk and spend the whole entire day there. And that is what our human social experience is reduced to in a lot of suburban parts of the US and even in Europe and other places. In Kenya, where I live, that's where youth go to hang out and look at each other and court each other, and that's sad. So the frightening thing, though, is where do we have in our landscape that our democracy can play out? Because as we start to privatize social spaces, when the only places that we can go to fraternize and be with other humans are privately owned and are in malls, and we're told you can't protest here, you can't march here, this is private property, how does our democratic voice come together, and where in that landscape does our democracy play out? So when we're talking about neighborhood design, protecting and creating those outdoor living spaces, those public gathering spaces, those places where we can connect with nature, and gardens and food. I'm not covering gardens in this section, but someone else will. Food should be a part of this. But parks, places that are enjoyable and beautiful, and just give respite from the hectic place that you might be in an urban area or suburban, traffic. It's very important to get those into our spaces, and there's a lot of ways that can happen. A lot of times when a developer is building, they'll be required to have an X number of parking spaces, depending on the use of the building. If it's commercial, it has X number of parking spaces per square foot. If it's residential, the same. And often, in many cases, there is a landscaping requirement. Maybe 10%, a little green strip around the building or something like that. So in public-private partnerships, very often when the government is trying to incentivize for the local developer to integrate public housing into the building or some other, requirement that moves them toward a vision that they have for that city, then they can get a tax break, an incentive to say, okay, if you put 10% of affordable units in this building, then we'll reduce your taxes for X number of years. There's so many ways to go about that from the city planning perspective. So, it is good to know, what are developers required when they are constructing new construction in your area, or even if they're doing renovations, and how can we incentivize them to create nooks between buildings or off of a sidewalk, a little bay into, off of a setback of a urban street, whatever. How can we work with public-private partnerships to reserve special little secret gardens and nooks that could become those outdoor living spaces? Whether it's formal, and we have formal urban design elements like benches and lamp posts and garbage bins or planter boxes, all those kinds of things. Or if it's something that we create with our neighbors, it's a little alleyway and we come together and make our own furniture and put up some lanterns and plant a bunch of things. So just make sure that when you're talking about neighborhood design, that you're thinking about the interconnectedness and having those special eddies for human trout to collect in and watch the river go by. Reclaiming your streets. So a lot of times people live on neighborhood streets or cul-de-sacs that are very, they can be very busy, and you have a lot of through traffic, and that can be threatening to little children who want to play in the streets. And you can do certain traffic calming measures like speed tables, speed turtle, speed bumps, stop signs, signage, traffic management measures. But there is a radical thing you can do, which is just one day a week or one day a month, is just reclaim the street, and that is shut off the street. Park cars, block it, create blockades, have a barbecue, have a party, have a wedding, have a football game or a sports event. And I think it's really important increasingly that people say, no, I reclaim this space. This is no advertising is allowed here. Read Naomi Klein's No Logo, by the way, in terms of our visual landscape and how the private sector and commercial sector is allowed to just bombard us all the time with billboards and advertisements. And so we can say, no, this is our street. It's Sunday. It's Thursday. This is National No Drive Through Our Street Thursday. So, yeah, get creative and get radical, get guerrilla, okay? Plant things where they're not allowed. Reclaim your space, reclaim your streets, reclaim your public spaces, get some friends involved so you can do it together and, deal with the implications. But increasingly, it's important for humans to say, we have to live together. We need to do it in a way that is pleasant, that is equitable, that is fair, ethical. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some other examples, but I think I'm going to cut it off here. Thanks.